When I was young, I'd listen to the radio, waiting for my favorite
Welcome to the
song.
internationally famous Radio Theatre.
When they played, I'd sing along. It made me smile. Those old melodies still sound so good to me as they melt the years away.
Here they come. Adrian Elsey.
When a girl marries.
Lux Radio Theatre. Good morning, boys.
Hello, world.
Howdy, everybody. Van Doogly.
Good morning, Sammy Sparrow.
What do you say, guys?
It's huge. It is the cream of Australian radio talent.
All my best memories come back clearly to me. Some can even make me cry, just like before. It's yesterday once more.
Mr. Jack Davis saying good night and thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Mike Hammond. Radio had its origins in a series of scientific discoveries made down through the ages. Great men with inquiring minds like Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Morse, Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison discovered how to use electricity and the electromagnetic energy field that surrounds us all. To help us look at how radio came to carry words and music, here's a man who, as the comic character Young Harry, once broadcast to an Australian audience of more than 5 million people. Harry Griffiths.
Back when I was clowning on radio with Mo McCackey and the gang on Calling the Stars, I don't think any of us thought too much about who was responsible for this wonderful invention called broadcasting. Well, it all began in 1900. Until then, the only thing heard on radio were beeps of Morse code. But a professor by the name of Reginald Aubrey Fessenden believed he had discovered a way to transmit words. To test his theory, he sent his assistant Alfred 1.5 kilometres away to listen on the headphones. And this is what he heard.
Hello, 1, 2, 3, 4. It is snowing where you are, Mr. Beaver. If it is, telegraph back and let me know.
The starting point for modern radio came when Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi took out his patent for the wireless telegraph. Soon afterwards, radio Morse code signals were transmitted here in Australia.
There was a bloke at Adelaide University, his name was Professor William Bragg. And in 1897, he was demonstrating radio. Now, that was the same year that Marconi was demonstrating radio, and it was only 2 years after the first deliberately made signal. Part of that is because of the telegraph, all centred on Adelaide. And so technology was very important for those vast distances.
6 years after Fessenden's first tentative transmission of words on the air, he achieved another breakthrough, the world's first radio program. On Christmas Eve 1906, Morse code radio operators on ships in the North Atlantic were advised to wait for a special transmission. They must have thought they'd entered a supernatural twilight zone when they suddenly heard voices and music in their earphones. Fessenden became the world's first disc jockey when he played a gramophone recording of some classical music. Gradual improvements in transmitters and receivers allowed amateur radio operators around the world to begin broadcasting programs, and boys everywhere learned how to build cheap, simple, crystal set receivers.
The pioneers of radio in this country really were a broad church. There was a huge amount of enthusiasm generated by backyard tinkerers, people that just enjoyed mucking about with valves and crystals and headphones and all the rest of it.
In 1920, the great Australian opera singer Dame Nellie Melba was called on to perform on Britain's first public radio program. Australia's first station was started in 1921 with the call sign 3ME and would one day become the national shortwave service Radio Australia. Also in 1921, an amateur station was started in Sydney by electronics enthusiast Charles McClurkin. He named it Radio 2CM after himself and broadcast each Sunday for 2 hours from his home.
McClurkin is issued with what was believed to be the first broadcast licence, an experimental one, but nevertheless the first broadcast licence issued by Billy Hughes, written in longhand and signed by Billy Hughes.
This home movie, taken by Charles McClurkin, held by his descendants and never broadcast until now, shows the aerial for our first licensed radio station.
And it was a powerful force in Sydney radio. It was very popular. People were listening to it everywhere.
When McClurkin introduced a live performance by the renowned musical comedy actress Josie Melville, Australia had its first incidence of radio stage fright. Apparently, the lady suddenly thought about the possible size of her audience and froze.
But she came good, and she sang very appropriately, "You Can't Keep a Good Girl Down," and "Look for the Silver Lining." These were the two numbers that she sang, the first pop songs on Australian radio, perhaps.
As it was one of our first ever broadcasts by a singer, McClurkin was amazed to get more than 2,000 appreciative letters from listeners. Here's Charles McClurkin ice skating in what is the only known film of this remarkable pioneer. Today, the call sign 2CM is reserved in memory of this great radio pioneer. Another amateur broadcaster was 17-year-old Otto Sandell, who set up a transmitter in his aunt's suburban boarding house.
But he also fixed radios, he built radios for people, and in the end, like so many others, he wanted a way of selling and marketing his radios. So he began a radio station, and that radio station was 2UW.
With the airwaves becoming crowded with amateurs, the federal government issued 2 broadcasting licences in each capital city to be funded by listeners paying annual fees. Station call signs were to start with the military code numbers for each state. Because the number 1 could also look like an I or an L, they started with 2 for New South Wales, 3 for Victoria, and so on. In November 1923, Radio 2SB was the first licensed radio station to go on the air. The opening program on 2SB was a concert featuring soprano Miss Dorothy Deering. The baritone was also the announcer, ex-Army recruiting officer Ambrose George Thomas Saunders. Saunders later became Uncle George, a well-known radio children's host.
Oh, Uncle George and Bimbo. They were the two who belonged to 2GB for the children's session. And Uncle George spoilt himself because one day they'd finished the children's session and he thought Bimbo had turned the microphone off. And he said, "Well, thank God that's over, the little devils." Which of course meant he didn't do the session anymore.
The next station on the air broadcast from a department store called Farmer & Company. It called itself 2FC, and one of its early announcers was Bryson Taylor, who later started a radio school and trained thousands of announcers. In 1925, Taylor had the job of introducing a performance on 2FC by a young pianist named Betty Higgins.
And the studio had an upright piano on a stand, and Bryson Taylor was there, and he motioned me not to make a sound, and he went up to the microphone and he said, "Our next artist is a young girl who is going to play a composition by Roy Agnew."
Betty Higgins would go on to be a successful presenter of women's sessions on commercial radio, including one offering helpful advice on organising weddings.
2FC Sydney, closing down until 7 a.m. tomorrow. Good night, everybody. Good night. Sleep well.
On the early crackling radios, 2SB's call sign was confused with 2FC, so SB changed its name to 2BL. Today, it's the ABC's Sydney local radio station, 702. The following year, Melbourne's first station, 3AR, went on the air, named after owner Associated Radio, while a second station, 3LO, took its name from 2LO London. In South Australia, Central Broadcasters Limited began 5CL in 1925, and 7ZL went on air in Tasmania. Perth's first station, 6WF, was started by Western Farmers Limited, while in Brisbane, the first station was the Queensland Government's 4QG. The early government rules required listeners to use radios called sealed sets and to pay a tax for the privilege.
You would choose a radio station that you think that you would like listening to, and then you would pay a government fee. And once you paid that government fee, you then could go out and purchase a radio that could pick up that station, but only that station.
But few listener licences were sold because radio enthusiasts simply listened to all available stations by using cheap crystal sets or making their own modifications to the sealed valve receivers.
The system was an absolute shambles. There was an inquiry and the government came back and they said, right, we're going to have a two-licence system. We'll have an A licence and a B licence system.
Enthusiastic businessmen immediately started up commercial stations around the country.
Slowly, advertisers found their way to the new B-class commercial stations. In time, great networks would be built, and with them came great fortunes. The old A-class stations, funded by the radio listening tax, would take a different route and eventually come together in 1932 to form the biggest Australian network of them all, the ABC. That story next, when we look at the empires of the airwaves. Broadcasting in Australia has had many pioneers, men with a passion for the medium and the drive to make their dreams come true. While many battled away without much reward, others made great fortunes by giving the public the entertainment they craved. They linked radio stations together into vast networks and then sold the audiences to eager advertisers. Here, to look at how Australian broadcasting really took off, is one of its most successful broadcasters, Alan Jones.
Thanks, young Harry. Well, look, when I was a kid in rural Queensland, the radio was an essential part of our lives, bringing not just much-needed entertainment, but important, sometimes essential information. When radio first got going, there were those who recognised very quickly the potential for broadcasting to bring vital information to isolated communities. They could see how radio could educate us, how it could nurture Australian arts and culture and unite the young nation. One in particular, a visionary businessman named Sir Ernest Fisk, could truly be called the father of Australian broadcasting.
Ernest Fisk arrived here from England in 1911 to run the local Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company. In 1913, he did a business deal that would have profound implications for Australian radio.
He signed a deal where he merged the Marconi company with the Telefunken company, which was another major radio company of the time. So the two rival companies he brought together and he formed Amalgamated Wireless Australasia, which today we know as AWA.
It has been said that the bonds of empire are invisible. You have had a demonstration, but not an illustration of that this evening.
Fisk and AWA became the driving force in Australian broadcasting, establishing the Marconi School of Wireless, which trained many of Australia's first radio engineers.
He was a giant in Australian radio, and he made sure, because he was also a very shrewd man and a very good businessman, he made sure that AWA remained there.
At first, AWA was content to collect its Marconi patent fees and sell technical equipment and expertise to the first radio stations. But in the 1930s, it set up its own network of stations and also became a major supplier of radio drama programs. In 1939, Marconi broadcast a message to Australia, congratulating Fisk and AWA.
Ladies and gentlemen, and my Australian friends, it gives me very great pleasure to be able to take some part in your ceremony today.
By the 1940s, radio was a major industry, and AWA had become one of Australia's largest companies, with more than 6,000 employees. Australia's first commercial station, 2BE, started in 1924. It closed down 5 years later, one of the only commercial radio stations in Australia to go broke. Radio 5DN Adelaide also began operating as an experimental station in 1924, but officially went on air in February 1925. On Australia Day 1925, commercial station 2EU was started by Cecil Vincent Stevenson, who named it after his shop, Electrical Utilities, which sold the exciting new wireless receivers. But the 2EU call sign was unclear. Some even said it sounded like a frivolous bird call, so the letters were reversed to 2UE.
Stevenson began 2UE in his home in Maroubra, and it was very much a sealing wax and string operation like so many of the early radio stations, but it was aligned with his retail business, which moved sites various times in the city and finally became known as Radio House, a very important supplier of radio parts and full sets.
Station 3UZ was opened in 1925 by electrical engineer Oliver John Nilsson, who later became Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Soon afterwards, Station 3DB, named after Melbourne's Drewry Business College, was issued with a commercial licence.
Dave Worrell was made the manager of 3DB in 1930 by Keith Murdoch, who had missed the boat, hadn't applied for a broadcasting licence, and had to buy the 3DB call sign and wavelength from the Drewry Business College.
Adelaide's 5KA came from its location on Kintore Avenue. In Queensland, the Toowoomba radio experimenter Ted Gold named his station Gold Radio 4GR, while Brisbane's 4BC came from Beale Chandler, its founder being iconic Brisbane merchant John Beale Chandler. Perth's first commercial station, 6ML, took its call sign from retail owners Musgraves Limited. It closed down during the 1940s. The 7HO call sign had a dual origin, its location in Hobart and its founder, Ron Hope. 2CA Canberra was typical of the smaller stations that began opening around the country in the 1930s.
The basic program consisted of records, the ordinary standard commercially available records. In addition to that, every time there was anything of any importance in Canberra, and sometimes not so important, we covered it. We covered almost everything that moved.
One important early radio pioneer and media mogul was Oswald Anderson, who ran several early stations and set up the Federal Group, the first commercial radio network.
Anderson saw a wonderful opportunity. He approached Fisk and AWA, who had just, only fairly recently, got their Beam Wireless service, the international service from the UK to Australia, working effectively. And he said, let's do something about the 1930 test series, Ashes series, between England and Australia.
The network broadcast telegraphed scores and other details of the Bradman Ashes cricket tests in England, leading to a great boost in sales of wireless receivers around the nation. For the historic broadcast, 3DB sports journalist Eric Welch began the first of the famous simulated test match calls, later perfected by the ABC.
He described the cricket from the shortwave broadcast when the team was over in England, and he used to be there with a box of matches alongside the microphone. And now Larwood's shaping up, and he's coming down to bowl to Bradman, and yeah, he lets go a beauty, and Bradman's got it, and it's gone to the boundary. People could hear this, you know. It's gone to another 4 to Bradman.
By the early 1930s, more than 300,000 wireless sets were in use. This was the jazz era, ruled by the radical Art Deco style, and the designers of the new receivers let their imagination soar. While commercial radio flourished, some of the fee-funded A-class stations were still struggling. So in 1932, they were finally transferred to a new Australian Broadcasting Commission. ABC Radio went on air at 8 p.m. on the 1st of July 1932.
Australian Broadcasting Commission relaying to the southern seas, also on a short wave for world.
The ABC quickly became a central institution in the lives of Australians in town and country alike. Much of its early programming was musical, and in its first year alone, more than 17,000 musicians and singers had worked on its broadcasts. Today, the ABC is Australia's greatest radio network, with stations reaching all major regional and metropolitan centres. It also broadcasts to the world via the internet and on shortwave through Radio Australia. The early commercial stations remained as they started, either family-run businesses or divisions of big publishing and music interests. Major religious organisations also moved into radio to spread their message. Eventually, every station was required to play some religious content, a rule that applied until church political influence waned in the 1980s.
Religion had a very, very important role. It was endorsed in this by the law, by the Broadcasting Television Act, which insisted on a quota of time for religion. It was looked upon as a very important aspect of broadcasting, and the stations did it voluntarily.
There were certain things that we could not put on 2SM in those days, and certain things 2CH would not broadcast. So we had to be absolutely sure that whatever we did didn't transgress those lines.
The Labor movement also saw the opportunity for political propaganda, and a passionate socialist named Emile Voigt convinced the Trades and Labour Council to start 2KY. Other Labor stations followed in the 1930s, including 4KQ in Brisbane, 3KZ Melbourne and 6KY in Perth. The K in the names was chosen simply because it was felt K was the clearest sounding letter. Throughout the 1930s, commercial radio station licences continued to be issued, despite the great economic depression then gripping the country. To reduce costs, they began to form affiliations, or networks, including the Major Broadcasting Network and the Macquarie Broadcasting Service.
This is Radio 2UE Sydney, a member of the Major Broadcasting Network. Eastern Standard Time is 8 o'clock.
And that was when 2UE really became alive. And that was affiliated with your Melbourne setup. They all got together then. They weren't just little bits and pieces. And it's exactly what it needed.
Macquarie would become the most successful of the early commercial radio networks. At its height, it was feeding advertising and programming to as many as 61 separately owned radio stations.
With the outbreak of World War II, radio programming changed forever along with the advertisements that fueled it. The misery and restrictions of wartime proved to be a boon to the fledgling radio industry. Coming up, radio advertising and those commercials and jingles you can never forget. But first, a word from our sponsors.
I even lend you my fur coat.
Oh, no, madam.
But how can you expect me to keep bath at it if you don't keep Protex soap in the house?
Maybe your servant trouble can be solved with a cake of Protex soap.
From the moment the early radio pioneers began setting up their experimental radio stations just after World War I, they realised they had the ability to make money. By charging clients to promote business and services, they could pay for their equipment. Here to guide us into the story of radio advertising is the broadcaster everyone knows as Pilco, Tony Pilkington.
Thank you, Alan. Radio's great strength as an advertising medium is that it's everywhere. It's also inexpensive, and because the commercials can be repeated many times over, listeners tend to remember the message. Now, the first radio commercial actually went to air on an American radio station way back in 1922, and it was for a property development company. It cost $100 and lasted 10 minutes. In Australia, things were a little slower to get going, and the impetus for the first radio commercial actually came from the advertiser, not the station.
In his early broadcasts on Radio 2UE, Cecil Stevenson advertised the products on sale in his electrical store. Then one day, Stevenson's butcher and loyal listener, Harry Woods, offered to pay him to advertise his meat. Early ads were stiff, formal announcements, but the station soon found music and jingles appealed to listeners and helped them remember the brand names. early commercials were mostly for local businesses, but eventually the big national advertisers came onto radio and had entire shows named after their products.
Welcome to the internationally famous Lux Radio Theatre, brought to you by the makers of Lux Toilet Soap.
Pure white Lux Toilet Soap, the beauty care of the stars.
Yes, 9 out of every 10 film stars use only pure white Lux Toilet Soap.
Once the shows carried the sponsors' names, it was only one small step to them actually producing the programs too.
Now, the radio boom was brought about by the shortage of newsprint during the war. Keeping the newspapers down to about 4 pages to conserve money for the war effort, advertisers had to go somewhere. So where did they go? They went to the radio stations.
World famous for nearly 150 years, Cashmere Bouquet Cosmetics are leaders of feminine loveliness and fashion.
Bud Tingwell and I were the voice of Colgate. I was the voice of Colgate and used to do the fragrance men love.
You can always tell a halo girl. You can tell by the shine of her hair.
The coming of the great radio quiz shows of the 1950s saw sponsors wrapping their products into every corner of the show. It was a less subtle form of what today in television and film is called product placement.
This is the thing, because just a couple of seconds spraying with that, and it works like magic. And it's the loveliest pine-scented smell. It really is beautiful. So you take that home, and I'd like everybody to know that there's nothing like this. It kills airborne bacteria, it makes your house fresh in just a few seconds. In fact, everybody is asking always now for Pressure Pack Aerozone.
Early announcers often made their names in the way they read the carefully written commercials. But others, like Melbourne's Nicky Witter and his breakfast show sidekick, a young Graham Kennedy, succeeded in boosting their sponsors' sales by departing from the script.
Now, what's wrong with a decent pair of brassiers? Oh, most important. I agree. If you get a decent pair, they'll last your lifetime. We know some women who, during the summer, they don't need them. And what do? Cut the centre ribbon, fill each little cup with earth and grow geraniums in them. Some even use them as jelly moulds. Yeah. These bras or whatever they are, they'll last for years and years, won't they? They certainly will, Nick, especially if you get them from Park Avenue. Yeah. They're in Hoddle House, you know, on the corner of Little Col and Elizabeth Street, on the first floor.
One old-timer famous for his unusual sales technique was an irascible announcer by the name of John Harper.
Ladies' Milanese bloomers are $1 a pair at McCarthy's. That's a zack a leg, and we throw in the elastic for free. Do I remember John Harper? Women love 'em. Balls, parties, dances, barbecues. You'll see them all at Bondi, the lovely girls lying on their dickies. The best surf towel you can buy, girls. There's 6.5 inches more in every king-size packet of Rothmans. You girls know that's a lot of inches.
Are you thinking of buying a panty girdle? Yes, we are. Are you? Well, you're right up my street. I want you to buy the famous Divine Panty Girdle. It costs $39.09, and if you have a waist 24 to 33 inches, you can buy it wherever a good girdle is sold.
He'd get people upset, he'd infuriate people, and then sell that same person a bottle of rum. You know? Just absolutely a unique broadcaster, yeah.
Early advertising was designed and judged on sales results.
I can remember doing a commercial for the Power Coaching College, Knowledge is Power. And it was a thing where you could ring in if you wanted to make further inquiries.
And all it takes is a few weeks. That can make all the difference to your child's exam results and ultimately to your child's future. JF6011, you dial that number right now, JF6011.
And he came in the next day and said, do you realise how many telephone calls we got, the Power College got last night? I said, I have no idea. He said over 700. And then I knew that he started to understand the power of the personality.
With the arrival of television, the transistor and top 40 music formats, radio audiences began to hear multiple products advertised repeatedly in short commercial breaks.
I want them to believe very much in the products that I'm selling. I don't believe in selling any product, and I never get over enthusiastic about any product unless I am personally convinced about it.
Commercial radio's biggest stars had always been consummate salesmen, but the new Top 40 celebrity disc jockeys became masters at giving their personal endorsement to dozens of products and services, and made millions in the process.
People always know when you're sold out, but they don't know about the millions of times when you don't. And, you know, last time I checked, Ross and I are not on television doing ice cream ads, or, you know, we're not selling products that we don't believe in. So, you know...
We're prepared to.
It's just we haven't been asked, that's all. Like, you know...
I would spend money on us.
Japanese cars, good. Toyota.
Horrible drunk.
Go Toyota.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Bourbon's good.
Valvoline, one of my favourite drinks.
I drink Valvoline for money.
Yeah.
I would, no, really, I would.
Look what it does to your hair.
Some journalists conducting serious news programs insisted their credibility would suffer if they read commercials.
I also had an agreement with 2GB that I didn't read commercials on air.
One of the great debates about radio over the years has been whether listeners like or dislike commercials.
If people didn't have commercials on commercial broadcasting stations, they wouldn't have commercial broadcasting stations. And they'd have a pretty dull program, frankly, because I think commercial broadcasting station listeners have become accustomed to commercials and they expect them.
I mean, if people were found advertising anything less than interesting, you know, 90% would be actually watching and listening to ABC products, and only 10% would be watching and listening commercial products. Actually, it's the other way around.
Radio advertising is successful for many reasons. Some just like the constant product information contained in radio advertising.
Don't cough. Take Wyckoff.
Put sparkle in your life. Remember Andrews for inner cleanliness. Buy Andrews liver salt today.
Some are charmed by the catchy jingles.
Louis the Fly, I'm Louis the Fly. Straight from rubbish tip to you. Well, that's auditioning again, you know.
If you were to say, I feel like a Tooheys, I feel like a Tooheys, I feel like a Tooheys or two, if you said that, that's one thing. But when you go, I feel like a Tooheys, I feel like a Tooheys, magic happens.
I feel like a Tooheys or two.
How can you be sure there are no white ants in the floor? Young people won't remember that, but certainly anyone that's been around for a while will remember that.
But perhaps radio has survived because its ads can reach audiences wherever they are. And what's more, it doesn't need to have pictures or be read.
If you've got an important message, they're shaving, they take it with them to the bathroom, they turn it on in the car, they can listen to it in the taxi, they can take it with them when they're watching the cricket, it's there, plug it into their ear. So it's a mobile medium and it's immediate.
When Australian radio began in the 1920s, the roles of men and women were clearly defined. When women married, they were usually expected to give up work and take care of the home and husband and children. So you might be surprised to hear that some of our earliest radio personalities were female. And after the break, we'll celebrate the contribution of women to Australian radio.
Let's leave it to the girls. Let's leave it to the girls. If you've a problem puzzling you and you don't know just what to do.
In radio's early days, it had a huge audience of housewives who spent their days cleaning, cooking, shopping, washing and looking after their children. There were few female university graduates and almost no women in business and politics or the professions. But there have always been female broadcasters, even if their roles for many years were carefully restricted. And to take us back to those times and to celebrate the talents of those women who did make it in radio, here's a broadcaster who's been a success around the world, Jonathan Coleman.
Thanks, Tony. By the time I came to radio in the early 80s, there were many fine female broadcasters. It had taken women a few decades of struggle to win equality of opportunity. Back at the start, in his first broadcast on the radio, Canadian Reginald Fessenden had done a concert that he intended both his wife and secretary should take part in, but they both got stage fright at the last moment. In Australia, the first female broadcasters were usually actresses who were quite comfortable performing before an audience.
Women quickly adapted to the radio and took over both children's and the so-called women's sessions.
3DB had a women's radio service. Long before anybody else, it was a special section of broadcasting for women from 11 o'clock until 12 o'clock every day, every weekday. And that was led by Louise Humphrey, who was known as the female baritone.
Women announcers were often put in charge of the hundreds of listener clubs designed to maintain the loyalty of female and child audiences. Many still remember clubs like 3XY's Good Companions Club, the 7HO Women's Theatre Circle, the 4BH Bridge Club, 6PR's Tail Waggers, 5AD's Kangaroo Club, and the 3AW and 7HT Women's Associations. One of the earliest of these was the Happiness Club, founded by announcer Eunice Stelzer in 1929. It provided great help and mutual support for women throughout the Great Depression. At its height, it had over 20,000 members. Country women were particularly loyal to the ABC's famous and long-running women's session host, Lorna Byrne.
I've always contended that one can be on a job too long, and I knew there'd be a stage at which I should say to myself, it's time to bow out. And I believe that time has come.
Another well-remembered women's host was Del Cartwright, a trained home economist who went on to host the first women's program on television, Your Home.
The good little woman in the home had to be told how to cook, how to make curtains, you know, good ways of cleaning your house and stuff like that.
Melbourne's Martha Gardner was on air for more than 30 years and was renowned for solving the everyday household problems. Another female pioneer who conquered TV, movies, theatre and particularly radio in its golden years was the leading actress and comedian Gwen Plum. Much loved for her brilliant wit and prodigious comic talent, Plum was one of the first women to insist on featuring interviews on current affairs, as well as serious book and theatre reviews. She also appeared on Macquarie's pioneering panel show, Leave It to the Girls, which canvassed women's opinions on listeners' problems.
Castrol Motor Oil, over a network of 68 stations throughout Australia, presents Leave It to the Girls with Terry Dear.
Let's leave it to the girls.
The format was later transferred to television as Beauty and the Beast.
I wonder whether she's not a bit of a fusty old thing and being too disapproving of what...
Do you think there might be an element of sour grapes in this letter too?
Yes, she might be the one person in the office who wasn't asked.
Betty Higgins was a sports announcer on the ABC in 1939, but it wasn't until 1940 that the ABC appointed its first female general announcer, Margaret Doyle.
Here is the Australian news. Servicemen are protected from their creditors by national security regulations gazetted in Canberra tonight.
We mustn't ever forget that women practically ran the ABC during the war when the men were away. A lot of the men were away, so a lot of very, very fabulous, fine ABC women broadcasters read the news and did everything.
By 1942, the ABC had 19 female announcers at work around Australia.
Why are you joining one of the forces? I said, well, I think it's my duty. They said, well, what's more to your duty would be to join the ABC. We need women announcers who are already trained. In fact, we have 3 women coming on, and they have to be trained, and the men won't train them.
Even at the ABC, the crisis of war didn't end the inherent prejudice against female announcers.
Oh, the men were terrible. They were absolute... Well, I won't say what I really think.
Along with Gwen Plum, there were 1 or 2 other women who managed to give their listeners a glimpse of life outside the domestic box.
3UZ, there was a very lively discussion, well, a very lively program, not altogether discussion program in the strict sense, that consisted of Mary Hardy, Frank Hardy's sister, and Noel Ferrier. And they would argue, and it was really quite a light, frothy program with a bit of satire in it, but really very good.
And she said, I don't want a photo of you, but you're welcome to one of us, which I think is rather marvellous.
Well, you're going to get one of us,
I'm going to send you one, Helen. I think that's outrageous. Good on you. I love that. I don't want a photo of you.
And then there was the opinionated former actress, journalist and socialite, Dorothy Gordon Jenner. Known to everyone as Andrea, a name she chose from astrology charts, she dominated her morning time slot in the mid-1960s.
My World with the Saber-Toothed Tigress.
mums and dads, here am I sitting in a chateau.
She was a woman who fired from the hip, no holds barred, but she was riveting radio. I just loved her because she was such a great larrikin, and she communicated so brilliantly, one of the really great communicators. And she wouldn't call the Queen her auntie.
On the line from this day tonight, we have Gerald Stone. Are you there? Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Andrea, how are you?
Hello, Gerald Stone. I've been turning stones over all my life and only just found one, and that's you, Gerald.
Andrea, any thoughts of retiring?
Yes, in a box, 6 feet below.
Andrea, you never fail to amaze me, and I'm sure all of us here, but we all wish you the best of luck on your new venture.
Thank you, you're a honey.
All right, Andrea.
But she was a very sexy, charming, charismatic, fascinating woman. She had, been through India. She'd slept with Maharajas and told everybody.
And she was always on the ball, and she knew what was going on. And she was quick, and she was funny, and had a good news sense.
And as a solo performer, she was, I thought, outstanding. And with John Pierce, I think they're an incomparable duo in radio that there has ever been.
As Macquarie's Director of Talks, John Pierce, a great announcer and talks personality in his own right, also produced one of the highest-rating morning programs of the 1960s when he teamed Gwen Plum with her old friend, actor Gordon Chater, in an ad-lib chat show called Off the Cuff.
They were really brilliant. They just made sparks off each other, and they were, one was a catalyst for the other.
Extraordinary what you can get in but early in the morning. I mean, look at us this morning at 7:30 we opened a laundromat. I declare this laundromat open at 348 Military Road.
They're going to call one machine Pussy and one Charlie. I bet Charlie breaks down every 2 minutes.
Yes, I bet you want to put your dirty linen into Charlie.
I'm wearing it.
Another female broadcaster was the entertaining and often outrageously funny Dieter Kob. Born Editha Brenner in Germany in 1923, she'd experienced a turbulent life, which added authority to her performances on radio and TV. But despite the spectacular achievements of a handful of talented and entertaining women, by the mid-1960s, the job of serious announcer, newsreader and current affairs commentator remained strictly for men only.
So when I had to do the cooking programs, I remember leaving out the sugar from some of the recipes, and I was very quickly sacked and sent down to work in news and current affairs, where I was the first woman, even in Sydney then, to work on news and current affairs. And I remember the news director was very puzzled. He was quite a short man, and he scratched his balding head. And he said, well, I've never used a woman before, but I'll try you for a while and get the feel of you, and if you're any good, you can get the job, which I did.
A key argument against women doing serious news broadcasting was the belief their voices sounded too light or too sharp on radio.
And I was always told that thing that a lot of women have been told over the years, and I think women are still often told this, that women's voices don't carry authority, the same authority as men's.
But a lot of women don't like listening to other women in radio. I don't know why this is, haven't a clue. But you put it on a new woman to do a show in radio, and the complaints come flooding in, get her off. It's really weird.
I do not accept that listeners don't like a woman's voice. I think that's absolute nonsense in the 21st century.
Some women in the early 70s, like Hilary Bamberger and June Gardner, were permitted to host music programs on the midnight to dawn shift. But it was the ABC's Margaret Throsby who became the first female pop music personality in radio's modern era.
And when I joined the ABC staff in 1967, there hadn't been any women as network announcers for probably 15 years. So in that sense, it was a first for it sort of broke that down. But I was alone on air in the Sydney market anyway.
We're talking from the time I started listening to radio in the early 60s through to mid-80s. I don't think I'd ever really listened to a woman on the radio.
An early contemporary of Throsby was Caroline Jones, who made her name on ABC national television before hosting her own morning radio show.
I think radio is crucial to us in helping to know who we are as Australians. We need a reflection back to us of who we are in every way.
The pioneering women in radio made their mark in a male-dominated world. But by the 60s, the women's movement was stirring and women began demanding a new deal. The change was to produce not only a new list of female radio stars, but women who read the news, delivered political editorials and grilled powerful men on air without fear or favour. After the break, the liberation of women on radio. The revolution in social attitudes that came with the women's movement had a lasting effect on radio. Most of the women who expressed any political opinion in radio before 1970 were entertainers, with the exception of the noted broadcaster and journalist Anne Deveson. Now to show us the way into the world of radio following the women's movement, here's a man who dominated the Sydney radio ratings for more than 30 years, Gary O'Callaghan.
It's a funny thing how something obvious sits there in front of you, looking at you, and you still can't see it. While plenty of women worked behind the scenes in radio, few of them were given the chance to be on-air presenters until the 1970s. And then suddenly, women started demanding equal opportunity and getting it. And lo and behold, once women were given a chance to show what they could do as announcers, commentators and newsreaders, and we heard how brilliant they were, we wondered why it hadn't happened long ago.
Our earliest female political commentator on radio was probably Linda Littlejohn, who raised feminist issues on 2UW and 2UE in the 1930s. She campaigned for divorce law reform and economic independence for women. But it would be another 30 years before a woman would again be permitted to take such a stand on radio.
Why the need for secrecy? Well, first of all, there's fear of ignorance and prejudice, even the fear that people are going to laugh at you. Take the use of the word lesbian.
Journalist Anne Deveson had just produced a groundbreaking television documentary in the 1960s when she got a phone call from programmer Des Foster offering her a morning radio show. Deveson challenged the prevailing attitudes to such an extent she found herself on the death lists of extremist groups. While backed by her immediate management, she did incur the wrath of the conservative media moguls of the day.
A message came through from Packer, from the old Frank Packer, to 2GB to get that woman off the air. And I was then summoned to Rags Henderson, who was, I can't remember, he was sort of number 2 from the top and was a rather intimidating little old man who sat there and ticked me off. But after that, nothing much happened.
Pioneers like Foster and Deveson had paved the way, and the growth of the women's movement in the 1970s meant listeners began hearing female radio news reporters and newsreaders.
So you had a critical mass of women who were some very good reporters, but all the decision makers were men, all of them.
But getting the serious jobs didn't necessarily mean that the old attitudes of certain news bosses had died.
There was a particular man who could be shocking to women, apparently. I never met him, but he was the great one for coming up and saying, "What's the matter with you today, love? You got your period. You know, you're not behaving properly." And he sort of monstered women, but he also incredibly developed others. So there was an amazing mentoring system, bringing women on, but you had to abide by the established rules.
Claudia Wright in later years I thought was a real groundbreaker. Hell of a stirrer, but you know, she did it very, very well, I thought, very well, and again with a sense of style, a sense of class.
I hope that you're not going to allow areas of misreporting to influence you, that we are a lot of mad women making a lot of mad noise.
She was ahead of her time. People couldn't quite cope with her, either the way she dressed, the way she spoke, or what she was about on air.
The last bastion to be stormed by female radio reporters was the Parliamentary Press Gallery in Canberra.
Well, within about 6 months of starting at the ABC, I decided that I wanted to be a political correspondent. My then boss, Russell Warner's response to that was, why would you want to go to Canberra? All that'll happen to you is you'll be chased around the gallery by a lot of dirty old men. I, of course, at the tender age of 23 or 24, whatever I was at the time, thought this was grossly insulting. He did prove to be partly correct.
And the very clear insult to the Prime Minister that he did not have the courage to resign his position and recontest it in a secret ballot, as his predecessor Bill Hayden did in 1982, is indeed a very real challenge to the Prime Minister.
And of course the explosion in the number of women from 1980 to 1988, when I went back, was extraordinary. By then it was almost 50-50, males and females in the press gallery. Radio was almost entirely populated by female journalists.
Jo Bjelke-Petersen banned her. She cut off Bob Hawke during a radio interview. Brazilian authorities wanted her locked up. The ABC found her too controversial.
Good morning. I'm Jane Singleton, and this is 2GB News Talk 87.
Amber, something extra special about you today.
Today, the gender of radio personalities is largely irrelevant, and women can be found in all areas of the radio industry. Stars like Wendy Harmer found humour in sexual politics when she explored subjects like the men's movement and male self-awareness camps.
And he said one of the little exercises they did away in these camps was to ask the men what flower your penis resembled. Anyway, so we asked, I asked the listeners, and there was various, ideas of geraniums and all sorts of, roses and hibiscus and all kinds of things. But my favourite one was the guy who rang up and said, self-raising flower.
For years now, women have been amongst the highest paid personalities in radio's most important shifts.
I don't actually think I'm a funny person. I just think that I'm a good balance, and I was always a gas bag. I just talk in class. I got in trouble and I got C's because all I did was talk in class. So it's ironic I turned out to do talking for a living.
Of course, there was one area in radio programming where women were given equal airtime right from the start, and that was as musical performers. Ever since Dame Nellie Melba sang on Britain's first broadcast in 1920, female singers were an integral part of music on radio. Radio was about to discover the real power of music.
That's right, Gary. On our next episode of Thanks for Listening, we look at just how music took over the airwaves and the crazy personalities who became the new stars, the disc jockeys. I hope you'll join me as we continue the journey. I'm Mike Hammond. Bye for now.